really like those alliterations, what can I say? And I also want to mention I am presenting on behalf of myself, as well as my colleague and collaborator, Christian Thomas of the Yukon government. He unfortunately could not make it today. He is heading to Disneyland in Florida with his family, so I don't understand why he would want to go there instead of come to snowy Calgary, but anyways. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today. This is part of my dissertation project, so something I'm very interested in, and as I'm in the process of writing right now, hopefully I have a lot to share with you, so bear with me. We've got a lot to get through in the next hour, but I'll try to make it as engaging as I can. So to start off, situating us a little bit, I'm going to be talking about ice patches in the southern Yukon territory. So here's a map, North America, Canada, approximately the location we will be talking about. It is colloquially known as the Southern Lakes region of the Yukon Territory, and it's within the traditional territories of my collaborators and friends from Carcross-Tagish First Nation, Kwanlin First Nation, and Champagne and Asiac First Nation. So to begin this project, doing my dissertation, I met with some of my colleagues at the Yukon government, Christian Thomas, the special projects archaeologist being one of them, and he came to me with this idea of looking at the ice patch project and moving it beyond the ice. So he started out, I began my PhD in September of 2019, and of course the pandemic hit right after in 2020. So I actually went up there in the summer of 2020 and isolated in a dry cabin for 2 weeks so that I could safely meet with representatives from each of these communities. And we together came up with the goals and outcomes for my dissertation project. So I like to work within this framework that Sheila Greer, who's the Cultural Heritage Manager of Champagne and Asiac First Nations, she talks a lot about this idea of research as service. So doing archaeological research for the service of Indigenous communities to meet their goals and outcomes. And I felt that was a really good place to start my project from. So from the very beginning, before I even came up with hypothesis, research questions, I asked the community what they wanted, what outcomes they would like to see, and then I've been basing my project around those. So we first came up with this idea of looking beyond the ice patches, and Christian came up and asked the idea, how do we monumentalize a mountain? So there's been hunters and land users throughout the high-alpine of Yukon that have noticed these features, these hunting blinds, you can see one there, and he wanted to see how can we monumentalize a mountain, looking at these archaeological features and looking at how all these relationships, people, animals, all interact on the land. So that's sort of the basis of where this project originated from. But I'm going to start with a bit of a general talk about what glacial and ice patch archaeology is and how it kind of originated as a subdiscipline. So as we know, the climate is getting warmer, things are melting, and it's pretty apparent. So this is actually a photo from the Mountain Legacy Project of the Athabasca Glacier, so taken in 1917 and again in 2011. This is a phenomenon that is happening globally, so it's not just isolated to Canada. Ice patches and glaciers are, of course, experiencing unprecedented melts in recent years, recent decades, as compared to in the previous millennia. One really cool project that actually just recently had a find that some really cool obsidian points that they found is the Secrets of the Ice Project in Norway. Check them out on social media. They have some really amazing finds that they're doing. This is an example of one of the ice patch projects they're doing. They're exploring a lot with the Lundgren Pass, finding some of the really amazing archaeology coming out of Norway and Europe. And what really started this discipline of ice patch and glacial archaeology was, I don't know if some of you remember, in 1991, it really kickstarted with the recovery of Ötzi. So Ötzi the Iceman. He was found on the Swiss, or on the Italian and Austrian border. He was radiocarbon dated, found melting out of the ice. He's about 5,300 radiocarbon years before present, so really amazing, well-preserved example of a Neolithic hunter. Some of the belongings that were recovered with him include some bearskin shoes that were stuffed with grass for keeping warm. He had an amazing grass-woven shawl. They actually need to update this reconstruction of him, because I think a paper just came out that said he actually has the mitochondrial DNA for like male pattern baldness, so him with all this hair, not likely an accurate representation of what he did look like, but of course we're always learning new things. There was actually arrow point that was found in his scapula. So he's actually one of the oldest unsolved cold case murders still out there. Very interesting. And he had some amazing tattoos. The preservation of this ice mummy was phenomenal. They were able to identify that potentially those areas where he was tattooed may have helped relieve some of the arthritis and some of the ailments that were plaguing him at the time. Some of you may not know that Canada actually has our own ice mummy as well. So Kwade Sinchi was found a few years after Ötzi. He was found in 1999 in the Tachenshi Alsek Provincial Park in northern British Columbia, that kind of borders the Yukon Territory. And it was two hunters who were sheep hunting in the area, crossing the glacier, and they came across, again, the remains of a hunter. Radiocarbon dating suggests that he perished in the summertime, sometime between 1450 to 1700 AD. This was a really remarkable recovery, and when these hunters found these remains, they contacted the Yukon government and Champagne and Asiatic First Nations, and they did a bunch of collaborative work to study him and his belongings. So some of what was recovered with him include a knife in a sheath, a cedar root woven hat, and a fur cloak that was sewn from over 60 Arctic ground squirrels. This was such amazing finds. It added to a cultural resurgence in some of these traditional practices within the community, where people wanted to actually relearn these techniques and traditions of doing this spruce root weaving, as well as making clothing with the gopher robes. The gopher robe that was recovered it was really well sewn and finely constructed, but you could see a few areas. He was determined to be about 20 years old at the time of death, so a few areas that ripped, and they hypothesized that he kind of repaired some of the less nice areas of his cloak. But he was likely traveling from the more coastal regions of the Yukon to the inland, and what's really cool, I think, is they did a mitochondrial DNA study of his remains. 250 people from the local community volunteered their DNA as well, and the comparison actually found that 17 people still living in that area were direct descendants of Kwade Sinchi, which in Southern Tutchone means person long ago found. And two of those individuals are Sheila and Pearl Callahan from Champagne and Asiatic First Nations. Really amazing to see that continuous people living in the land and being able to reconnect with their ancestral, the descendants reconnecting with their ancestors. And actually 15 of the 17 who submitted their DNA actually belonged to the Wolf clan. So very likely that Kwade also belonged to the Wolf clan from that territory. So a really interesting study. So this leads us to now the Yukon Ice Patch Project. And this is a video from Christian of one of the recoveries. So you can see for yourself what some of the excitement of doing this research entails.
Hello, we're here. It's August 25th, 2018. We're at the Friday Creek Ice Patch, and this is the second time we've been here this year. We wanted to check because there was quite a bit more melting, and when we walked up to the ice patch, our helicopter pilot Dion once again walked directly up to this completely intact throwing dart. It's got 3 feathers, fletching, and an intact stone point. Doesn't appear to be broken, but it does have 2 sinew straps on it, which might indicate that it's been repaired, and it may be a 3-segment dart. So this is the most intact throwing dart that has been recovered from the Ice Patch Project in Yukon and probably anywhere in the world. What a great find.
So that is Christian, if he was here to present, but we included his voice anyways. So yeah, that's some of the amazing finds we are helping to recover that are melting out of the Yukon ice patches. There is a whole paper coming out about this particular dart. There's been a lot we've learned from these remains, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And just to kind of give you a little bit of this experience, the snow falling like it is outside right now, and a lot of what that black stuff we're standing on is all layers and layers of melted out caribou dung. So if you can imagine the multi-sensory experience of ice patch work, it's not always as glamorous as they make it out to be. So we'll talk a little bit about what the difference between an ice patch and a glacier is, just for those of you who may not be glaciologists in the room. So ice patches are not glaciers, they are different. Glaciers are formed via incredible accumulation of snow. They're typically formed in valleys and are actually mobile. People tend to use glaciers more as travel corridors, particularly in Yukon and Alaska, going from the coast to inland. Ice patches, conversely, are where snow accumulates and compresses, and it is not mobile. So due to the different moisture gradients, you get these mesoclimatic conditions that distinguish the glaciated terrain along the coast with the ice patch terrain further inland. So where the ice patches accumulate is actually considered to be a semi-arid environment. But the reason that we have these snow patches is due to this phenomenon of blowing snowdrifts. So these wind will create small zones of concentration where the accumulation of snow will persist. And then these form in the winter. It's typically along the north-facing slopes. So of course, in the northern hemisphere, we have the sun on the equator shining. So the southern slopes are going to have a lot more sunlight. But where you get these snowdrifts accumulating on the northern slope, they're not going to have as much access to sunlight. Like the mountain's going to be blocking it. So the snow is going to persist. They do partially melt, of course, in the summer months. And high in the elevation, we can see this increasing melt. There's a quote from Claudio Titelbaum talking about some of these ice patches. In his book, he says, "The majesty of the ice fields is beyond description. He who has been fortunate enough to be there once remains bound forever. To a theoretical physicist working with black holes, the ice fields produce a familiar vertigo, the instinctive certainty of being confronted by something so simple and beautifully extreme that it must be of importance." And I had that same experience seeing these ice patches for the first time, and this desire to want to know more about how people use this landscape and what their experiences are like up here. So in this landscape, deep drifting snow will persist throughout the summer, and then we see maximum melt conditions usually in about mid-August. So these two slides kind of showing what the accumulation can look like throughout the summer with that extreme melt. And these drifting sites dot the landscape with snow persisting until late summer. And they're a widespread feature of the ecosystem that was likely more prevalent during the cooler periods of the Holocene. So of course we are experiencing a lot less snowfall now. It's also very interestingly associated with critical habitat for very important species in this area. So one of the most important, of course, being caribou. And this is some data from the Yukon government. We can see, with that yellow star up there, you can see that's approximately the location of the site we'll be talking about today. And it's located within this fall seasonal critical habitat for the caribou. Within the Yukon, there's two different types of caribou. So just kind of going through this, that brown blobs are showing the location and the herds for the barren ground caribou. So barren ground caribou, they have a really large horizontal migration pattern. They traverse large areas during their seasonal round. These green blobs are the woodland or boreal caribou herds. They don't have as much of a horizontal migration pattern. The site we're looking at with that black star there is in the location of the ibex and Carcross caribou herds. And it's, of course, within the traditional territory of Carcross-Tagish First Nation and Kwanlin Dun First Nation. And what's interesting about these herds is we can see a really distinctive seasonal pattern in their migration. So these red blobs are showing the approximate GPS collaring data of where the caribou are hanging out in wintertime, in December. You can see that they're kind of in the lower valleys. As compared to when we take this collaring data and we show it for July, they're moving up to the high alpine during the summer months. So basically, caribou hanging out in the low valleys during the winter, and then moving up to the high alpine during the summer. This is a really predictable phenomenon, and it's something I've observed many times up there. So I've got a lot of pictures of caribou on ice now coming up, because I'm proud of taking these, I don't know. And it really got me interested in trying to understand how all of these relations interact on the mountain, and why this unique and importantly predictable characteristic of these certain animal species, why these areas have been for so long sought out for generations for hunting on this landscape. So as you can see here, the caribou congregate on the ice, and they'll just hang out there all day. It's of course because these animals are built for colder climates, and especially with the increased heat that we're experiencing now, they're seeking this out as a place of refuge for the warm climates during these summer months. Caribou aren't the only animals that are utilizing this area. So you can see from this drone video also, those little white dots there are sheep. So there's also a lot of sheep that will traverse to the high-alpine to escape the heat of the hot summer months. And for the curious caribou, as well as the cautious sheep, there is an additional benefit provided from the high-alpine for the sheep, is that they're able to really utilize those extreme cliffs and the extreme topography of this area to evade predators. So they really like to hang out in some of these really high alpine areas to escape the heat, to evade predators, and also for anyone who's worked up north or even worked around here, to escape these really awful things, bugs. So blowflies and the botflies are like nothing you've experienced before when you go up north. So the ice patches also act as an affordance for the animal health. So it's for thermoregulation as well as an insect avoidance strategy. And there's some ethnographic literature that talks about during some times of the year not even being able to, well, if you hunt the caribou, their hide would be pockmarked full of holes from these botflies laying their eggs. So it's definitely a big consideration as well for why these animals were likely seeking these resources in the high alpine. And we can see, based on the thousands of years of dung accumulation and some of the fossil or faunal remains that have melted out of the ice patches, that this has been a tradition that has been ongoing for millennia. So the area of focus that I am centering my dissertation research on and looking at is this area called Alligator Lake, which is near this volcanic complex. And it's actually a pretty recent volcanic eruption, only about 9,000 years ago, which on geologic scale, pretty recently. And Alligator Lake is a very important communal place for summertime fishing, and people would gather there. I actually recently learned that I was always like, why is it called Alligator Lake? Like, there's no alligators in the Yukon. And an elder was telling me it's actually a mistranslation of Altogether Lake. And basically, through a long game of telephone, it became alligator. But Altogether Lake makes a lot more sense. So it was an important communal space for summer fishing. And of course, access to these higher elevation areas in the mountains seen here to access these ice patches. So what you see in red here are each the GPS location of a hunting blind that we helped to document at this site. So there's over 60 hunting blind features that we've surveyed, and I think it tells a really interesting story about land use in this space. So the black area showing those hunting blind features located in the high alpine in proximity to the ice patches, and then the lake seen down below. And through some of this GPS collaring data provided by the Yukon government, this is showing how some of the sheep are accessing that area. So you can see again, moving from the lake to the high alpine and accessing those resources. And then the caribou as well, overlaid in pink here, of course, just wandering around everywhere, hanging out in these areas. So this is the modern GPS data, but we have faunal remains also melting out of the ice that tell pretty much the same story, that these animals were using these landscapes, hanging out on these ice patches for thousands of years. So these bottom two graphs are showing, so this is showing the distribution of the faunal remains at 5 distinct ice patches in the Yukon. So Texas Gulch and Sandpiper, which are 2 further north, and then the bottom 2 here are from the Alligator Lake ice patch. So you can see with the amount of green, there's a lot more of the caribou faunal remains that we're finding in these ice patches as compared to the sheep faunal remains. But this is pretty unique to this site. Within all of the ice patch recoveries, we can see it is a majority of caribou, but there is quite a bit of sheep. But there is a lot of intersite variation from the recoveries of sheep and caribou remains from these ice patches, as well as a smattering of other animals and some unidentified faunal remains. But this is definitely a phenomenon that has been happening for many years. And recently, of course, with the melt, we've been able to make these recoveries as they emerge from the ice. But of course, we have a very narrow window to seize this opportunity to make these recoveries before these artifacts and these snow patches are gone. So we use helicopter transport to do our sites, and again, I thought it was very funny that video from 2018 was a helicopter pilot. And this was again our helicopter pilot, Kieran, who found an Any Lake Point in one of the blinds, so he got out of the helicopter and immediately was like, oh, look at that. And I just want to say I've never found a point in 10 plus years of doing archaeology, and he landed on a snow patch for the first time and immediately made those recoveries. So helicopter pilots are really making their place in history here, I would like to say. So we'll talk a bit about some of the recoveries that have been made from the snow patches and how they actually landed there. So some of these hunting lines are facing the snow patches. So we can see these two hunting lines here are actually oriented facing towards the snow and would have been used for opportune hunting on the snow. We have, out of the 64 blinds documented, only 7 are actually facing the snow or in sort of a 50 to 100 meter distance of actually being able to hunt an animal if it was on the snowpack. But it has allowed for a recovery of really amazing artifacts that have melted out of the snow. Here's just another example, some of those hunting lines associated with the trails, and then some of the GPS locations for the recoveries of the artifacts that have been made. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the scale of these landscapes, there's one of my colleagues down there, like these ice patches are large. It doesn't come across quite as well in the imagery, but they're immense, so that's just us surveying kind of the toe of the ice patch there, looking for these objects as they melt out of the ice, and again, those layers of caribou dung, you can see there. Sorry, I don't know why it's going back and forth like that, there we go. Yeah, so here's some of the artifacts that we've found in this high-alpine. This is actually part of a snowshoe, really amazing preservation. That's, of course, that perfectly preserved atlatl dart recovered in 2018. Some really amazing artifacts. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what Christian's work has been doing for the last little while, exploring what these artifacts can tell us about hunting histories. So usually, as we know as archaeologists, for preservation, we typically only get sort of the points. We typically only get the inorganic material that is going to preserve in most contexts. So what's really cool about the Ice Patch Project is we have this opportunity to learn more about how the tools are constructed and created and what sort of symbolism and messaging and function goes into the larger artifact. And how these tools were designed for hunting and how they embody the knowledge of hunters for the environment and the animals that they occupied. So there's a 9,000-year collection of predominantly well-preserved hunting weapons melting from the ice patches. So these really ancient wooden projectile shafts with points still hafted on have taught us so much about how these landscapes are being used and for the time period. So this is a chart just showing the uncalibrated carbon-14 dates along the x-axis. And what's really cool about this is you can see that very distinct, very sharp transition from the use of atlatl for most of the history to the transition in bow and arrow. And we can see that so distinctly from the points that are actually melting out of the ice patches and from these finds. So Christian wanted to explore more about what information is embedded in the artifact. So hunting arrows have proven to be good indicators of technological design and can inform differing species-based hunting practices. So from the ethnographic information, we know that a rule about Dene hunting design is that different arrows were made for different animals, based on humans observing their environment and creating decisions and making functional changes due to that. So for the Dene arrow, there was an arrow for every occasion. There's 3 styles that are commonly described, but I'm just going to talk about big game arrows for this. So for the large game arrows, they're often described as composite weapons with barbed, antler, or bone points, and they're designed to detach from the shaft once they penetrated the animal. The preferred point style was made from antler, and the arrowhead would stay in the animal to allow the hunter to track it and eventually for it to die. And the length of the arrow was described variously. So what type of arrows are actually found in the ice patches? And this is really significant as a lot of the antlers or arrows made of antler have been preserved and have provided a lot of insight into this differing style of big game arrows. So for the big game arrows, the most prevalent are shorter arrows with spruce shafts, and really importantly, these detachable points on the end here. So with these, both the shaft and the point are designed to facilitate the separation of the two parts upon impact with the game. The second style that is observed are these arrows with fixed points. So these are longer arrows made of birch or hemlock, and as you can see, the point is really affixed within the shaft. It's not removable. And you can see some of how they're attached using a strong scarf technique. So the rationale for why there's two different types of big game arrows is because there's two different species that they're hunting. And Christian tells a really cool story about his sort of aha moment of making this realization. He was showing all of the ice patch arrows to actually high school students in Whitehorse, and it was a young boy who was maybe a hunter or had some experience, and he looked at the barbed points and he was like, well, obviously those are for sheep, because when you shoot a sheep, you can't track it. It's going to go to the cliffs and then you're never going to be able to get the meat. So those ones are going to be for sheep. Versus a caribou, you can wound a caribou, you can track it, and you can still get that meat. And he was just like, mind blown, oh my gosh, of course. So this led to a whole deep delve into sort of these different ideas of different arrows being used for different species and how knowledge is actually embedded and transferred in the artifact. So within the function and design of arrows, there can be multiple meanings within it. And Catherine McClellan observed some of the weapons and said, some of the Aboriginal designs that might easily pass as simple geometric decoration are really highly stylized representations of animals and other cultural phenomena. So she asked, does spiritual power emanate from this representation? We can never know, but we can accept that these objects were imbued with a greater meaning than their obvious function implies. They are decorated, and these decorations have complex meanings. They represent aesthetic stories, an array of animal and human identities. While we strive to see the meaning in design, we're now starting to understand that what we thought were strictly functional elements, such as barbs, seem to be designed in a manner that may also impart identity. So what function do these barbs serve? On the surface, these barbs serve to, as from these points, appear to keep the arrowhead from falling out of the animal. But in the collections gathered from Yukon and Alaska from the ice patches, we consistently see these two types of barbs. Barbs that are pointed, like these examples, and barbs that have been squared off, like these examples. They almost look like feathers or wings, and it's not certain what this style means, but it's likely an identity marker. As well, many Dene groups are socially organized into moieties, and archaeologists recognize and acknowledge that multifaceted meanings of these designs. And this is especially apparent with this recovery. This is an example of symbolic barbs, so they don't serve any functional purpose, but they were still really intentionally included in this artifact. So this demonstrates that they're not just functional, but there must be a more complex understanding beyond the symbolic expression that may hold deeper meaning beyond just the function. So these arrows were engineered to fly, but they landed in a world governed by biology, behavior, and cultural realities beyond just the function of these arrows. So what is therefore recognizable in an archaeological artifact? What we see in the archaeological record we can use to interpret function and identity. This is further complicated by preservation, and it's important when we consider artifact typologies with arrow points that we contemplate function as well as identity within our interpretation. Because what is recognizable as an archaeologist from the archaeological record can be assigned to identity, but that may not reflect the maker's identity or the object's true function. So these questions are what has helped to shape my understanding of looking beyond the ice patches at how people are using and interacting with this landscape. So when I started this project in 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022, the Yukon has actually been experiencing increased precipitation rates. So for the first time in many decades, the ice patches are actually getting bigger. So this provided us a really unique opportunity to actually see these landscapes in what they would have looked like with snow and with ice present. But it meant, of course, that I was not going to make a bunch of cool ice patch finds because they were melting the last couple of years. So switching gears, I decided to look at the cultural meaning that was embedded beyond the ice patches and look at this question of, is snow a landscape affordance? So ice patches are one type of affordance, and a large snow patch is, of course, a predictable resource, as we talked about. Animal and sheep are going to go there during the summer months. But why were certain areas selectively targeted over time? So what was the rationale for people selecting to hunt on this particular ice patch or this particular landscape? And within sort of the archaeological language, James J. Gibson's concept of affordance implies that the landscape affords obvious possibilities for action. So the affordances of the environment are what it offers or provides for the animal, either for good or ill. So these characteristics can allow for a predictable resource that can be frequented through time. And it can be a really valuable resource for understanding hunting practices and how it's demonstrated in local knowledge. So from this perspective, one thing the hunting blinds really offer is that you're able to stand in a place where someone in the past has stood. You're able to observe the same things they observe and get a sense of what they're seeing on this landscape. So from here, we're able to see that's Alligator Lake down there. We're able to see that there's a mineral lick actually located in the side of the mountain here. So the sheep, while we were collecting our data, were continuously going to this area and licking basically the salts, calcium, and all the minerals that are there. So as well as the snow patch, which we talked about, that provided that thermoregulation and insect avoidance. So we can see people were frequently using this area, and here's one of the examples of hunting blinds in this landscape. So similarly to the information provided from the artifacts themselves, we can demonstrate landscape knowledge based on how people have modified the landscape by constructing these features. So here we can actually imagine the hunter crouched down, maybe observing the ice patch. This is kind of where I began this thought process. Of course, the animals would be coming down from the lower valleys, coming up, and then it would be an opportunistic hunting. And yeah, a lot of what I perceived for these hunting blinds were that they were for that moment of kill and for opportunistic hunting, but I'll talk about how my perspectives have broadened quite a bit. So, as there's so many features on this landscape, I decided to employ UAV photogrammetry, so drones, to map and document this landscape. It's a really large area. It was difficult to map. We had a lot of different factors to take into consideration: access, time, weather. So I decided to use drone photogrammetry to map these sites. And Jen is from Cultural Heritage Manager from Carcross-Tagish First Nation, has a cool sort of anecdote with how the drone kind of can symbolize raven in a sense of providing that unique perspective of the landscape from above. So after some preliminary surveys in the summer of 2021, I spent a week up there with youth from Carcross-Tagish First Nation and Champion and Asiatic First Nations, and we documented the landscape together with Christian Thomas from the Yukon government. And I did this 3D documentation using this DJI Mavic 2 Pro, and for the drone nerds out there, I'm going to do a little bit about the drone, because I think it's pretty cool. So I used the UAVs and an RTK GPS survey to conduct this work. I chose drone-based photogrammetry as it's non-invasive, therefore repeatable. It's cheaper than the ground-based survey excavations that we were planning on doing. I had the skill set and experience that I could help provide for the community. And just the scale coverage and what we were able to identify beyond sort of the expectations that were met, I think is pretty cool. So how drone photogrammetry works, you basically just take a drone and you fly it in overlapping transects back and forth, and you just take photos of the ground at an oblique angle. So not perfectly straight down, but sort of at a bit of an angle. You want like 70 to 80% overlap before each of the photos. I used Pix4D capture, so I literally flew it off my iPhone. This is an example of the screenshot. So you can fly for one battery on my drone. I think I had access to about 5 batteries, and then I brought like a solar panel charger battery up there with me to charge the drone. But in one 20-minute flight, I could cover an area of about 150 meters by 150 meters to 1 centimeter ground sampling distance resolution. So I covered all 11 acres of this mountain, 1 centimeter resolution with the drone. I then brought all that data back down south with me and processed it using Pix4D Mapper. It's an awesome software. And I was able to create these orthomosaics, which are basically like 2-dimensional photos of the landscape, as well as these 3-dimensional digital surface models of the landscape. So this is what I've been using to now conduct my analysis. So based on this data, as well as the sheep and caribou data, I've started to come up with these different categories of the hunting blinds and beginning to explore the different uses of these hunting blinds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these examples of the different hunting blind categories now. So as you can see from the sheep and caribou GPS data, highlighted there in orange is the location of the mineral lick. So again, the sheep are using that mineral lick. We can see it even today in the GPS data. And again, the caribou hanging out on the snow. They really like it there. So that was pretty evident. And this helped to inform some of why these blinds might be situated where they are. So for the first example, there's the approximate location of the mineral lick. And this is an actual hunting blind drive line complex that was observed in this area. So the location of the mineral lick in orange there. We'll zoom into this area. This is just the satellite imagery showing the hunting blinds, and you can kind of see from the satellite imagery some of these trails across the landscape. It was really hard when we were actually like walking along the ground to see any of these trails just because we're in this volcanic pumicy environment. So I did a bunch of drone flights over this area, and when I actually represented the landscape with this digital surface model, some really awesome things jumped out at me that I hadn't previously anticipated. So, for example, this trail we can see cutting right through that drive lane complex. So it's made up of 6 drive lanes, likely indicative of communal hunting strategy. And again, that knowledge of the landscape, you could not see this trail visible from just walking around, but people knew that the animals were moving from the mineral lick to the ice patch, from the valley up higher, and they've actually left their trail embedded in this landscape, and it's cutting right through the middle of this drive lane complex. So demonstrating really complex knowledge of animal behavior. Another type of blind that I've seen a lot of are these type of blinds that are overlooking sort of these, calling them bottleneck ridges, but areas where the animals are moving from the valleys up to these areas of affordances, and they're taking these predictable high ridges. And 40 out of the 64 of these hunting blinds are associated directly facing trails. So they're not actually facing the ice, and they're actually looking at trails of animal movement. So what's really important is all of these hunting blinds are oriented facing downslope of the valley, which makes a lot of sense for the primary wind direction with the wind coming upslope. And they're associated really closely to trails. So a lot of the research about hunting and ballistics or artifacts talks about, what penetration or what distance will you get optimal penetration and hunting. Most of the hunting blinds we're finding are within 5 to 10 meters of a trail. So if those are opportune hunting locations, distance really isn't a factor at that distance. Like a lot of what we might think and understand doesn't kind of come into play because these are a lot closer than what we were previously experiencing. And another thing to kind of consider when using drone technology and the way I'm applying it is that when we view the landscape from above, it's really a Western colonial gaze of looking down on the land. And that is a different experience than walking through that landscape and what the hunters and land users would have experienced being in these places. So from this hunting blind, from the hunter's perspective, we can actually see these trails cutting through the landscape. That's what they're looking at. We can see a caribou running along that trail here. And through conversations with hunters and knowledge keepers and land users, it broadened my perspective so much that these hunting blinds aren't just about the kill. This is evidence of landscape management. These are actually blinds that are about looking out in the land. So the hunter is sitting here, and they're not just like looking at a trail, they're overlooking the valley, they're looking at these grazing areas, they're monitoring the impact and the health of the herd. They're making really selective decisions for animal migration and movement and making decisions for future generations about how to really manage that herd and selectively harvest. So there's oral history and ethnography about not killing the leaders of the caribou herd because they have scent glands in their paws or in their hooves. And basically the other animals need to follow that scent trail, and if you kill the leaders, that's going to cause a negative impact to the rest of the herd. So those management decisions, we can see that evidence based in these blinds of where people are seeking refuge from the wind and this really amazing space to be able to see this. So it's really important to remember that we engage with these spaces differently if we record them with technology or if we're actually walking through and experiencing these landscapes. So I think when we use digital data, we need to sort of consider how are we effectively sharing and documenting and interpreting these storied places. So one of the outcomes identified by the community partners that I work with are to have hunters and knowledge keepers and land users that guide the interpretation, not just from my project's outsets, but now that I'm doing this work and interpreting these spaces. So I've been meeting with the James brothers and talking about how this landscape is used, how it's understood. There's been a lot of knowledge about the windscape, the smellscape, and so much more of the complex experience of this landscape that is embodied in these hunting blinds. So for me, a really important part that kind of changed my perspective on it is even the language that we use to describe these features. So I started out referring to them as hunting blinds. That's the language I knew. But in Southern Tutchone, these actually translate more to a game lookout. So it's not just about the opportunistic kill on that landscape. These are spaces of game management, game lookouts, and like care on that landscape. So by looking beyond the ice, I really was able to broaden my understanding that these spaces deserve recognition, and they can stand as monuments of Indigenous histories that have for so long been diminished by colonial practice and the sort of orthodox practice of archaeological research. So a lot of this is a way for community members and archaeologists to collaborate together to explore these spaces. And some of the most impactful experiences for me have been the engagement with the community members. So this is hunter Keith Wolfsmarsh. We spent some time at some hunting blinds that he found when he was out hunting. I was gracious enough, he shared a story with me about being a hunter, hunting sheep for the first time when he was 9 years old with his Uncle Sammy, and how he was 9 years old and he hunted his first sheep, but he wasn't strong enough to carry the horns back down the mountain with him. So now he's been hunting all the time, just trying to kind of recreate the experience from when he was a child and like bring those horns home and like feel that success. So he actually told me this story about the first time he found these hunting blinds. He was sitting, resting after a sheep hunt, and he said he blinked his eyes a few times and looked around, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm surrounded by these features of my ancestors. And when I actually flew the drone and did the digital data and I processed it, I feel like I kind of got a little bit of that same sense when I went from the orthomosaic and I turned the digital surface model on. I was like, oh my gosh, there the features are, like, just jumped right out at you, but they're so well disguised in the landscape. It's something that we've been only afforded sort of through these experiences and through this technology. So in pursuing this knowledge, I've had the opportunity to work with some really incredible people, and from hearing the voice of Sheila Greer playing in my mind, she says, again, that research is service framework, that archaeology should be thought of as a service, a technical service. We have for too long held the pen, the voice on First Nations and Indigenous history, and especially for the material culture and the problematic and colonial past. So having the opportunity to learn from elders, to bring elders up to these places, we've been able to share and experience these places together, which has been so enlightening and engaging. And even for bringing youth out to this landscape. So there's been a moratorium on caribou hunting, and Brandy Mays has communicated from Kwantlen First Nation, has communicated how this has sort of led to a bit of a impact in the relationship between people and caribou, because you can't have that practice of hunting anymore. But through doing this ice patch research and through doing archaeology, that's one avenue to begin to sort of have that cultural resurgence again and re-engage with those relationships. So by bringing youth out to this landscape, one really inspiring citizen from Champagne and Asiatic First Nations, I was lucky enough to work with, Kyra Chambers, had this quote that I thought was really powerful. She said, "It's so humbling to think I'm walking the same footsteps that my ancestors walked in. Our people have hunted in this landscape for thousands of years, and we're still here today. This shows the continued connection to the cycle and a relationship between people, caribou, and the land." So I think creating these experiences has been so impactful to myself in the project, and I hope to some of the community members we were able to bring out. And for me, it's really brought up this fact that even in what seems like the most remote and uninhabited landscapes, this pile of rock can actually be representative of a moment of refuge, an escape from the wind, and evidence that you can still find community family, even in what seems like the most remote of places. So we're now working together to create outputs and interactive databases with the First Nations to see how we can further explore and get more interpretation, more perspectives on some of these landscapes and how they're used and how they're experienced and understood. So looking at what information is actually coded in the archaeological record and how we can best explore this. I think it's been really interesting to understand that these objects exist within a matrix of cultural knowledge, and a variety of culturally, ecologically, and biologically informed practices determine how objects and structures were designed and where and when these activities took place in the landscape. So I think my three big kind of takeaways from this is that archaeology service can be a really valuable framework to guide research and meet community outcomes. Digital technology can be used to allow multiple perspectives of the landscape to be examined and explored, and I hope can provide a more holistic understanding of the landscape. And that archaeological interpretation should be a collaborative endeavor and done with the unique cultural framework of the places that we are studying. And this is my acknowledgements, and if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them. Thank you. And I'm going to put my favorite meme up there too.